welcome to the Agronomist, everybody. This is Ontario Diagnostic Days edition. Thanks a lot for joining us here this morning. Really looking forward to the discussion. Ontario Diagnostic Days it's really cool to be able to present these episodes to you. We've got so much great research and extension work that's being done in Ontario. And this is really an opportunity to really showcase that, and you're going to see that in today's clips. And the great thing is, just like if we were doing this in person in a field somewhere in Ontario, you can interact with the experts, and we've got a couple great ones here today. I do want to mention before we get started the sponsors of Ontario Diagnostic Days: Pride Seeds, the GFO, Agris Co-op, BSF, Bayer and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, Mosaic Company, and Syngenta. So big thanks to all of our sponsors here that make all of this happen. At the bottom of the screen during the show, I'm going to be putting the link so you can get your CCA CEU credit, so make sure you take that opportunity. If you have any problem with it, I just recommend that you just get a hold of Albert Tenuta, and he'll help you out with it for sure. Okay, so without any further delay, let's get started with Ontario Diagnostic Days. The Ontario Diagnostic Days on realagriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BSF Canada, Bayer and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, the Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta. And the best part about when we do these live episodes of Ontario Diagnostic Days here on The Agronomist is that you get to participate, you get to ask your questions. So whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or realagriculture.com/live, you can ask your question, enter it in the box wherever you're watching. We'll get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. Let's bring in our first expert here. It is Tracy Bowdy. She's a field crop entomologist with OMAFRA based out of the Ridgetown campus. Tracy, how are you?
Great, thanks. How are you?
Hey, great. It's awesome to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to showing your clip. It's very a la sort of Rick Mercer walking through a cornfield. So, Tracy, you're going to talk about corn rootworm. Now, this is a pest that seems like it's coming up more now that we're talking so much about the possibility and actual evidence of resistance.
Yes, absolutely. BT hybrids have enabled us to do continuous corn acreage across North America, but at the same time, we're relying heavily on that, and it's increased the risk of resistance. So as those populations have built, we've started to see those adults come out and be much more prevalent. So it's now time for us to really be paying attention to this issue and addressing it before we have no more BT hybrid solutions.
Yeah, I've got some questions about genetic solutions here in a bit, but what we're going to hear today, I'm sort of assuming, is that rotation.
Absolutely, yeah. Crop rotation is the biggest #1 solution to deal with this pest, because they need corn to live as the larva, and if we get rid of it for a year, maybe even 2, which would really wipe it out, it would save us a lot of headaches from trying to find other management tools to use.
Okay, well, I got a whole bunch of questions for you, so let's do this. Let's watch the clip, and then we come back. I've got some questions, and the audience can also get some of theirs in as well. So let's watch the clip with Tracy Bowdy. Here we go.
Tracy Bowdy, field crop entomologist with OMAFRA. You may have heard me talk a lot about Bt-resistant corn rootworm last year based on the detections that we found here in Ontario. But this risk is still serious and a problem that we need to focus on and change in the next few years. We are at the cusp of being very similar to what the US is now dealing with, where they have complete resistance to all of the Bt proteins, the Bt hybrids that we use for rootworm management, and no longer can fully rely on them. And now they are using multiple tactics, including soil applied insecticides and foliar insecticides, which foliar in particular is not a sustainable practice or a recommendation, but we also are seeing resistance from them in the US. So it's really important that Ontario corn growers, and in particular the continuous corn growers, need to start showing more sustainable management tactics that include crop rotation to help reduce this risk of resistance development and kind of reset the scenario here so that we still have Bt hybrids to rely on in those high-risk areas and high-risk years of like third-year corn to manage rootworm. Rootworm larvae need corn to survive. So as long as we don't plant corn year after year, those larval populations will die out. So if you plant soybeans or alfalfa or wheat following a corn crop, those larvae won't be able to survive and they'll die off, and you'll kind of reset the whole scenario. So then adults still have to come back to the cornfield the next year and lay eggs again and start building those populations up. So again, sustainable practices include rotating out of corn. We've really heavily relied on Bt hybrids to have us be able to plant corn after corn, but that's really not a sustainable practice going forward. Instead, rotate. Part of resistance management also includes scouting. If you've planted a Bt rootworm hybrid, look, especially in July and August, for signs of high levels of adult activity. These include abundant number of adults, more than you'd see in a typical year, especially if you start to go into second year and third year corn. Take a look and see if you actually see adults. Also, if the silks aren't there yet, the adults will actually start feeding on leaves by scratching at them. And of course, they will also start to clip silks. And so if you see signs of abundant adults, that's one potential sign of resistance, especially if the hybrid was planted with a below ground or a what we call a rootworm Bt hybrid. Another sign is goosenecking, and I have a good example here where the larvae feed. There's another example up here too. The larvae that have been in the soil this spring because of the eggs that the adults laid last summer, this time of year, those larvae start feeding on the roots of the plant. And because of that clipping, the plants try to compensate for that and start trying to grow, but they actually gooseneck. You can see the bowing of the stalk. And so this is a good sign that there's enough clipping from the larva that shouldn't be there. That clipping injury is really a sign that they've overcome the Bt protein. And so look for signs of goosenecking and lodging. We would come in ourselves as OMAFRA or Jocelyn Smith, also as part of the executive Canadian Corn Pest Coalition, or your seed provider. We'll come in and dig these plants in particular that have this goosenecking, rate the roots. You'll see that video by Jocelyn of how do we rate those roots and determine if we're at a level of potential resistance, and potentially collect adults. So again, signs to look for and report to your seed provider or myself or Jocelyn. Abundant adults, feeding activity from adults, more than usual, the leaf feeding, the clipping, and of course the telltale sign of potential resistance is the goosenecking and lodging of the plants. A new initiative here in Ontario and a collaboration with several states, including Iowa State, is the new rootworm adult sticky trap network. There's about 400 sites across North America that Ontario OMAFRA, we are collecting all the data from and mapping for the entire network. And it includes putting these yellow sticky traps out weekly during R1 for several weeks, up to 8 weeks, to monitor for adults. And this, we're hoping, will tell us the abundance of the rootworm population, if it's a good rootworm year, the distribution of western and northern corn rootworm adults, and really the ratio of that, and also hopefully identify some problem areas that we need to go and investigate if we find that they have abnormally high rootworm populations and it would be planted to a BT rootworm hybrid. So on these sticky traps, checked weekly, you'll find the adults that stick to them. This is a western corn rootworm, and the way you can tell western and northern corn rootworm from each other, western has yellow and black stripes. The females have bleeding black stripes, whereas the male is almost fully and completely bled black stripe across their backs, and I provided video of those. Again, western has the black and yellow stripes, whereas northern, they are a little bit smaller than the western, but they will have greenish yellow color to them. And it's important for us to know what their distribution is, because northern used to be mainly an eastern Ontario and Quebec species, and western tended to be much more just a southwestern problem, but that's changing. We know there's northern corn rootworms in Dresden area, but we know even western corn rootworm has expanded towards eastern Ontario and Quebec now. And so this initiative, we're hoping, will help us map the data and show us really what's going on with rootworm, and it also identifies potential management solutions going forward for these two species. So please, if you're interested, contact us. We have sticky traps to give to growers and crop consultants, and then just keep an eye on the mapping network and see what these populations are like, so that you can be more informed of the risk in your area and help you make better management decisions going forward.
Great job, Tracy. Awesome.
Thanks.
Okay, so the way you outline that, it seems like a rather simple issue to solve. It's rotation, as we discussed, but as we've seen in Ontario, we've seen in the Midwest, corn acres are not being reduced, even though this pest is really inflicting some damage. So how do we balance that? Obviously, it's the economics overruling some of the agronomics.
Yeah, exactly. And the real driver is feed for livestock, right? So understandably so, the livestock producers need corn to feed their livestock. However, they're going to learn, and even just last year, a brand new issue popped up with one silage grower who lost 50% of his yield in the very first year of finding resistance in his field. So it's no longer going to be an option for them. They're going to need to do this to help maintain or at least stabilize what we have left of the BT proteins, and helping reduce the population so that we don't have such a high ratio of resistant adults out there, because all 4 BT proteins that we use in combinations in these hybrids have the potential, and in the States are fully resistant. Here, a lot of them are. We just can't rely on them fully now.
Yeah. Okay, question here from Mark Davis watching on Twitter. He says, what about a 3-year rotation of corn, beans, and wheat, no-till with corn residue there all 3 years? Is that helping you?
Any rotation out of a crop for a full season, besides corn, will help. Anything that you go into in the fall as a cover crop, for example, has no impact, because the rootworm are already eggs in the soil until next spring, and there's really no feeding activity or any impact what we do in the fall to early spring crop. What it is that drives it is what's there in June, July when those larvae are out there feeding. So if it's corn or volunteer corn in a soybean field or any other field, they will still survive. But any other host or non-host, beans, alfalfa, you name it, it'll kick back that population and they'll die.
Some good questions coming in here from the audience. Encourage everybody to continue to put them in. Peter says, who's watching on YouTube, do we have the extended diapause rootworm variant in Ontario that is delayed hatch and overcomes a 1-year soybean break?
I knew Peter would come out with a tough question. We think we do. Especially, so extended diapause is specific to the northern corn rootworm. And that's why we're starting to do this mapping project, because we need to see where their distribution is and identify potential areas where this extended diapause might be. We do know of one site that we had in Eastern Ontario that it sounded like it. But the only way we really can confirm that they're there is if we set up tents, emergent tents, to see those adults actually come out of the soybean fields. To know, yes, they were definitely, they laid in there, they chose to be there. So that is something that we hope to look for. But it does play a role in then looking at how you manage the rotation. We may, in these situations, want to rotate for more than 1 year out of corn to break that extended diapause so that we go maybe 2 years soybeans, 2 years corn, or some combo like that to help kick that back. And diapause, Lindsay says, what's diapause? It means that those eggs, a portion of the population stays as eggs for another year. So they go through a full season without changing. Yeah. And then they come out when we put corn back into that field again. So if we go soybeans, and they come out that second year and it's soybeans, they die. But if we happen to go corn, soybean rotation, they keep finding corn whenever they come out. So that's the diapause.
It is amazing how nature adapts. Question here from Gord watching on YouTube. So with a corn, soy, wheat cover rotation, no need for the BT trait. If we are using BT hybrids in this rotation, are we contributing to resistance development?
Yes, absolutely. It's been, the BT has always been in the best agronomic hybrids, and that's why we just keep using it. But really now we need to start using, especially the below ground BT traits for high risk years. And that typically is third year corn, because it's taken them 1-2 years to build up the population enough to actually cause injury and see yield impacts. Using the low ground BT trait in a typical 3-year crop rotation, so first year corn, enables adults to be exposed and continue that resistant development.
Okay, great stuff. Awesome questions from the audience. Okay, let's watch clip 2. It's with Jocelyn Smith. She's going to go through how to rate the roots and how to make that evaluation, and we'll get back to more of the questions from the audience after the clip. So let's play clip number 2 with Jocelyn Smith.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about the Western corn rootworm life cycle and how to rate roots for corn rootworm injury. So in southwestern Ontario, we typically say that the rootworms start hatching around June 10th. So the previous year, the beetles, the adults, laid their eggs in the soil, and those eggs overwintered. They've got to go through that cold diapause period, and then in the spring, around June 10th or so, they start to hatch. And I hope you can see this, but this vial shows the size of the first instar larvae that hatch out in the field and start to feed on really tiny root hairs and small roots of the corn plants. As the corn develops, so do the larvae, and they go through a second and third instar stage, and they get to be about just over 1 centimeter long, and as they get larger, they feed on larger and larger roots. And you can see there's a pupa in there as well. Eventually they'll pupate after about 3 weeks or so, and then we start to see beetles emerging, typically around the end of July in southwestern Ontario. And the beetle emergence will go on for a few weeks, and they will be The adults will feed on the pollen and the silks and the leaves if the corn isn't silking yet, and eventually mate in the field, move to other more late planted fields possibly, and lay their eggs in those fields. And so that's why crop rotation is the #1 way to control corn rootworm, because they have to have corn roots to survive. So if you plant corn in the same field that was corn previously and there were rootworms present, then you may have an issue. But if you rotate to a non-host crop like soybeans, wheat, or alfalfa, all of these little guys will die once they hatch. So that's the best way to control corn rootworm. But if you cannot rotate and you've got corn on corn, you may end up with rootworm feeding in that second year, like we see on some of these roots. And so this is some pretty significant feeding injury here from corn rootworm. And the way we evaluate that is using a scale that's called the Node Injury Scale that was developed at Iowa State University. It's basically a rating out of 0 to 3. 3 being you've got 3 entire roots that are basically pruned off by the rootworm larvae, 0 being no damage, of course. And so you typically look at, when you do your root ratings, which we recommend you start doing around the end of July, mid to end of July, early August at the latest. And you want to do that because the pruning damage is easier to see then, and as the plants start to regrow, like in this case, it's more difficult to evaluate how much injury was there previously. You start to see a lot of regrowth, and then it's just harder to see. So what we do is dig up these plants from the field. We often like to soak them in water for a little bit to let the soil soften up, and then wash it off either with a high pressure washer or a good pressurized hose. And then you can really see the injury very clearly on the plants. So this plant would be an example of a bad one, and you can see that this first node of brace roots, basically the entire root or the entire node has been pruned back by the rootworm feeding. So we would give that node a rating of 1, like 100% of the root has injury. The next node you would look at as well and decide what proportion of these roots on the node have rootworm feeding injury. And again, this is probably 100%, so that you would add those two up, that's 1 plus 1, and then you would look at the bottom node and you see that there is still some more feeding here, so you would probably add maybe 20 or 30% to that. And so you take those 3 numbers, add them together, and that gives you your total score. So this plant would be about a 2.3 on the node injury score. So this is the way to also look for corn rootworm resistance to the BT events. These are SmartStax plants from a field where we think we have resistance developed. And if you were to dig up the plants, and on average, if there was more than 1/2 of a node or a 0.5 on the node injury scale, then we would call this a field with unexpected injury. And so that's concerning in terms of resistance. So if you see that, we would like you to contact either myself or Tracy Bowdy with OMAFRA or your seed sales representative to investigate. And so what we would do is come in, we would gene check the plants to make sure they are expressing the rootworm traits that we think they should be. We would do a bunch of root ratings to see whether we exceed that threshold, and then if we do, we would collect a population of beetles from that field that we bring back to Ridgetown and collect their eggs from them and test them for resistance in the following year. So just to repeat, the unexpected injury threshold is 0.5 on the node injury scale for a pyramided product, so one that has more than one rootworm trait or rootworm BT present, like a SmartStax or a Duracade or an AMXT hybrid. If it was just a single rootworm event being expressed in the plant, then the threshold would be 1. If you have more than one node of damage, that would be unexpected injury. Yeah, so that's how we're looking to monitor for resistance for corn rootworm. And western and northern corn rootworms both do the same type of damage. There's really no difference, and you also can't tell them apart as larvae. The 2 species are almost identical. It's the adults that we're going to show you in another video that are good for identification. The westerns being the black and yellow ones, and the northerns being the greeny yellow beetles.
Great visuals there from Jocelyn Smith. So, Tracy, after I do the rating, then what? Like, what do I do with that information?
Yeah, so it's especially important if you're seeing any clipping, especially evaluating, like Jocelyn said, July, August, early August, to see that injury. Report it. Reporting is the quickest way for us to be able to really understand and take in-season samples to test. So that would be to your seed provider, corn company, or anyone in the executive of the Canadian Corn Pest Coalition, which I'm the chair of. And why it is because even digging and looking at the roots helps determine if it rules out other factors like lodging from, no roots on the corn, compaction, any other issues that may have caused, or herbicide injury, for example, that may have caused that plant to fall. But if you actually see the clipping that says, no, this is rootworm. And to be honest, like it also gives you an idea of how much yield you're going to lose. For every node, one node gone is 15 to 18% yield loss. Oh. And those sites that we saw last year in Blythe and Brussels in the problem areas had a root rating of 2 or more. And so that tells you right there that those growers are losing almost 40, 50 or more. Some of them had 3 nodes gone. So it's important to really get to understanding what's going on in your fields and know when these are true failures of those hybrids.
I like how Iowa State University came up with the rating system. It's like out of 3. It's not like out of 15 or 27, something complicated. It's like out of 3. That yeah. Keeps it straight for people like me. So I think this is the question that everybody has on their mind. And Francois asks it, can the seed companies come up with brand new BT genes, or is that technology exhausted? Do we have a next generation of BT traits coming, do you think?
There aren't any. They're using what is available because rootworm in general was tough to control with BT regardless. So the proteins that we have are the ones that we have for a while. They have turned to RNAi technology to try and supplement with these BTs. Problem is RNAi is also not a sole silver bullet. They need to be incorporated with these BT proteins to get enough control or protection. So the fact that we're losing the BT proteins will also have a negative impact on our RNAi technology that's coming out. Those two need to be used in combo to actually be effective. Rootworm, in general, has a really good mechanism for overcoming anything you throw at it, whether it's rotation, whether it's different insecticides, and now the technologies. So it is really important for us to change it up on them. And because they're never going to want to go extinct. None of these pests want to go extinct. So they work around it and find a way to tolerate it.
Wheat Pete asks, the recommendation is not to use underground BT traits in the second year of corn. Seems counterintuitive to him. Do I use an insecticide in second year corn then?
So going forward, we may have to do that because, again, using 2 years in a row of BT technology just increases our resistant risk. What you can do, though, is scout your first year corn in July and August, and especially the month of August. If you're seeing 1 adult per plant in any of those scouting trips, that tells you that there's enough eggs going into that field that second year corn might be at risk and needs some protection. So that protection can come from soil insecticides, preferably, so that if you're going to go a third year in corn, you use your third year and hit it up with the BT technology. Another option we're trying is those biocontrol nematodes. We're hoping that those can actually help add another component of management for this pest so that then we really do only have to focus on the third year and whether it's a higher risk and need management tools for that year.
Okay. Francois, watching on YouTube, asks, can rootworm larvae feed on other grass species, or are they highly specific to corn?
I knew, Francois, you have some great questions. Yes, they can. They don't do well on them, but if we had a sustainable grass species in those fields for 2 or 3 years, they will start to build up. Not all grass species, there are specific ones. But in general, corn is still their main go-to. And really, those other species of grass are just a substitution until they can get corn again. So they're in survival mode at that point.
So what is it about the corn root then?
Just the chemicals and the nutrients that they get from them. They can detect the CO2 coming off of roots and then go to them, and then they start to get some of those chemicals as soon as they nip into it, and they love it.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. Hey, awesome stuff. So informative. 2 great videos as well. Tracy, you're going to come back at the end of the show. I'm sure the audience will have more questions for you, and we'll bring you at the end, okay?
Great.
Awesome stuff. That is Tracy Bowdy. She, great work there. Fantastic information. She's a field crop entomologist with OMAFRA. Okay, let's hold on here. Tracy, I'm going to take you off the screen, go back to just me. And I do want to mention once again our sponsors here today for Ontario Diagnostic Days here on The Agronomist. The GFO, Agris Co-op, BASF, Bayer and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, Mosaic Company, Syngenta, and Pride Seeds. Once again, thank you to all those sponsors for supporting Ontario Diagnostic Days. Okay, let's bring in our next expert. There he is right there. It is Albert Tenuta. He is field crop pathologist with OMAFRA out of the Ridgetown campus. Albert, how are you?
I'm excellent. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic, man. Great to have you here. Okay, did you hear at the beginning where I said if anybody has troubles going to the website below, they just contact you directly? You're the support guy.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Okay, awesome stuff. Okay, hey, let's get to our next topic here, and we're going to be talking about white mold. And this is kind of a similar to sclerotia issues in canola out west. If you have yield, like white mold's sort of an indication there's some bushels out there. So in some ways it is a bit of a positive indication, but it can be a yield robber if not dealt with correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that tipping point, right, where we start seeing the benefits to the injury or the impact on yield and that. And then, we'll discuss that as we move along. But on that early end, one of the first things I learned 30 years ago from many growers was that, hey, a little white mold isn't bad. It means I'm going to yield well. It's just that fine line between that benefit and then that impact on yield.
Yeah, so we got a great clip coming up here. It is yourself and Dave Hooker out in a field talking about this issue of white mold, and I believe they're 30-inch beans, and just you can see that canopy closing. I've got a bunch of questions, and I'm sure the audience does as well, but let's roll with clip number 3.
Excellent, thank you. Albert Tenuta here on Ontario Diagnostic Days with my great friend, Dr. Dave Hooker, University of Guelph. Physiologist, agronomist, you name it, he'll answer it. Just throw it his way, it's great. Hey, we got a lot of questions around soybeans at this time of the year, all the environmental conditions, the crops growing crazy, the canopies are filling. What influence does the canopy have on yield, as well as, hey, of course, everything comes around diseases, right? And white mold in that.
Yeah.
So, right, Dave? So, go for it.
I can't believe, look at these beans, Albert. Aren't they beautiful? The canopy is great, filled in the rows, essentially. These are 30-inch rows, and the beans are at R2, full flowering, and the canopy, the rows are basically filled in. This is the exact canopy that we need to maximize yield. Of course, the canopy is needed to intercept the sunlight in order to generate high photosynthetic rates, in order to maintain a good growth rate to build seeds, a high yield.
Yeah, and growers are adapting their management practices to take full advantage of that canopy potential and ultimately maximize their yields as well, right?
Yield is so important, so that's pretty much on top of every grower's mind when they talk about canopy development. Like, what can we do to influence the canopy to maximize that yield, maximize interception? So we've got row width under consideration. You've got, depends on where you are in Ontario with that row width response, like that should be considered as well. And plant population, the seeding rate. That is another very important factor for that canopy.
Well, fertility too, right? You're an expert on that side too, right? So anything like that that builds gets more mass, quicker growth, fills those canopies quicker, right?
Exactly. And that fertility depends on like pH, the cation exchange capacity, the rooting capacity. You're an expert in root rots and soybean cyst nematodes. Like there's a whole like plethora of factors here that we need to consider.
And I'll let you say those big fancy words and all that stuff. But we know that the canopy can influence Sclerotinia, right? The pathogen that causes white mold. And so that canopy not only impacts its growth, but its potential for infection as well, right? Beautiful sclerotia. If I'm a sclerotia sitting down there in the soil, it's just perfect in terms of that microclimate, the humidity, the moisture, develop my apothecia, get my ascospores, not the other word Dave's thinking here, and get up there and start to infect those flowers, those blossoms from R1 right through to till they're gone, right? And those senescing flowers are the key there where you get that infection going. And so this canopy, how it starts, it really drives a lot of that risk.
Yeah, exactly. So the more canopy that you have, of course, the yield potential is favored in that environment, but we also have something that we need to contend with, and that is the white mold. So really we need to figure out what can we do as managers to build that canopy, to form high yields, but also to protect that yield potential by thinking about managing white mold.
Yeah, and so we know different varieties have some tolerance. We don't have anything that's truly resistant to white mold or Sclerotinia. We have some differences in tolerance. So, that's a start. It's not enough there to protect under these environmental conditions that we've had this year are pretty favorable, right, Dave? We would say.
That's right.
And that. So there's that. The big question now is the fungicide side.
Yeah, that's right. So Albert, these are at R2 stage right now. So there's a flower on one of the two upper nodes, and that would be at R2. And this is the stage, this is one of the critical stages when we need to think about fungicide applications.
Absolutely. So you've got to ask yourself, what's your risk? Are you in a canopy like this? If these were 15-inch rows, this growthy, the environment would be really conducive, especially if you got a history of white mold in those fields. That would be one that maybe I would be thinking of those 2 spray applications, right? So you would be at this point, maybe even a little earlier when you could get in there, and then you follow that up with that R3 and a half application. In other conditions, you could be waiting a little bit longer till that R2 and a half, R3 application and go with a white mold product. In that case, go away with that one application and go for it as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it seems like every Crop Diagnostic Days has say that, farming is all about risk management. Albert, we have wet conditions in southwestern Ontario, at least anyway, persistent wet conditions. We have full canopies, like the canopies in most soybean fields look great, look awesome. So we're kind of at a high risk situation, and so that's why we need to be thinking about maybe 2 fungicide sprays instead of just 1.
Right, absolutely. Then this is the year probably where, it's going to pay, right? Our yield data would show that, you're looking at on average, what, 2 to 3 bushel on fungicide application?
That's right.
And if $15, $16 or more beans, you're paying for your application and the cost there as well.
That's right.
If there's going to be a year, this is the year. But again, assess your risk, target those fields that will have the greatest potential return, and go for it.
So we got the weather risk. We've got big lush canopy risk. We've got maybe a row width risk. The risk may be a little bit lower at a 30-inch row versus, let's say, a 7.5.
Yeah.
We've got white mold history risk in the field. And we have whether we can apply a fungicide or not, we can reduce that risk a little bit. And you and I talk about the disease triangle all the time, and I love talking about the disease triangle. And this is a perfect example on how to understand that disease triangle, what needs to be understood in order to manage this disease.
Yeah, so that environment, the host soybeans, and the pathogen there, this is a year that the disease triangle's going to make a pretty easy decision for you.
Albert, you two got pretty excited out in that field.
Oh, I have a great time with Dr. Dave. He's a good friend of mine, and he lets me ramble, which is always good, and abuse him.
Okay, so a question. Now there was a bit of a breeze rolling through those soybeans. Is that helping you mitigate the risk, or is it making it worse?
Yeah, so any factor, as as Dave and I mentioned, in terms of row spacing and plant populations and all that, it's all canopy modification in terms of allowing or reducing the favorable environment for the sclerotia and the apothecia to develop, and that. So yes, the breeze going through will help. There's a whole thing. That slide there that showed, the difference between those, those wider rows and more narrow rows, and also you have to take into consideration the history of the disease, the sclerotia numbers, and that. And what you want to basically be doing is modifying the canopy, and you can do that again with varieties and that architecture. That's hence why we always see those more taller, tighter soybean varieties tend to have less mold than the bushy type, because again, you're that air movement through there. And what we're trying to do is modify the canopy conditions so that you're throwing off the ascospore release with the flowering period.
So how do I know? Like how much white mold is too much white mold where I know I'm going to have, like, it seems like there's some real sort of experience and what's happened in prior years. What does my gut tell me? Am I asserting that right?
Absolutely. In most cases, the history of the field and what's gone in the past drives a lot of the decision, and that risk factor. A year like this year, where you've had a history of white mold and the conditions have been quite favorable throughout, and these constant rains. This morning I woke up and again, heavy fog, heavy dews. I went out to take some photos for some, tar spot and that. And again, all soaked. Those are ideal conditions. Leaf wetness is actually better than rainfall in many cases. So that trigger there depends also on your row spacing and that. So if we think of those narrow rows, so those 7 to 14-inch rows versus say those 30-inch rows, in many cases the apothecia production and that is significantly higher in the narrow rows. Some of the work out of Wisconsin would show, and previous work out of Greg Boland's lab at the University of Guelph will show a 60 times more apothecia. So you might be looking at 10 apothecia under a 30-inch rows versus 600 or more under those narrow rows as well. And those narrow rows, because the environment is more conducive to development and speed up, that those spore showers, those ascospores, also coincide with the flowering period. Whereas on those narrow rows, you're delaying it more so. So now you're still getting ascospore production or the spores being released, but now you're into more of that pod fill, those R3 and beyond stage. You still have flowers there, but the risk is less in terms of the number of flowers that can be infected.
Question here from Mark Davis watching on Twitter. What about a half rate 3-pass R2, R3.5, and R5 in a high fertility heavy canopy?
Well, again, we got to look at labels for things as well and make sure that we're on those. We haven't looked at those. Again, anything beyond that. Let's go on the back end one. Actually, we retweeted a tweet from from Damon Smith out of Wisconsin this morning, again showing all the work that's been done on that R5 and beyond as we get into seed fill periods. We haven't seen those returns on those late applications. Basically, we call those revenge sprays. And previous years where we've had significant white mold, sure, we could get some greening and it looks good on the top with those R5, R6 late applications. The only problem with that is the infection is down low, right? We're not getting to the problem where the white mold is. It's still going to develop, and you're going to still have that development on those stems and that's what's going to choke off the top part of the plant, and that's where your yield loss is going to come. So our research in Ontario, the data through the U.S. and that, if you go to cropprotectionnetwork.org, there's some great summaries there of much of the regional results there, that under those high fertility, heavy canopy, wet conditions, favorable environment, that's where that 2-pass application comes in, and that much more beneficial.
Dr. Hooker mentioning here in the chat that suppression of white mold with 2 fungicide applications greater than 20 bushel response versus untreated check. That's pretty, that gets your attention, I guess is the best way to put it.
Oh, absolutely. And it goes back to that, your original comment in that, a little bit of mold is pretty good, right? So you start seeing that, but quickly you start seeing, when we talk about disease incidence, we talk about disease severity. If we put those together and come in with a disease index rating or so, if we start seeing that, 25%, 20%, 25% under those narrow rows, we're going to start seeing that yield decline after that. If we get into those wider rows, that starts pushing beyond maybe into 30, 35%. Again, you can tolerate a little bit more mold under those wider conditions, lower plant populations environments.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, Albert, we got to move on to the next topic, which is one that I know you've been very diligently working on. It is a growing, concerning issue in Ontario, and that's tar spot. So give us the description. We've got a great clip here, but give us the description. What is tar spot?
Well, tar spot is a new, we'll call it a new endemic disease to Ontario. It's one that's gained a lot of attention over the past 5 years. It's one of concern. It's one that, as we go through the video and we discuss it later on, it's one that we should be aware of. We shouldn't fear tar spot. We've got the tools. We just got to work on our management and get it out there. So we're in a good position.
Okay, let's watch the clip. Here is some info on tar spot.
So one of the big questions we had is, can tar spot overwinter in Ontario? And yes, it can. So we're in the same location that last year, it's late September, had the most tar spot that we had in the province. We came back this year, corn in here. We've actually got some trials in here, and I'll talk about those in a second. And yes, the lower leaves are scattered. It's low incidence, low severity right now, but it did survive, and we can see many of these leaves will have maybe 1 or 2 lesions, and we're starting to see a few more moving up the canopy as well. So what does that mean? Hey, we're getting into tassel time, we're getting into fungicide time. One of the big questions is, should I be targeting tar spot? Yeah, it's important to know whether we have it. Again, we don't have a situation where it is challenging yield right now or so, but we found it last week in early July. Is that early? Yeah, for Ontario, for sure it's early, but how does that relate to other areas of the US and in the Great Lakes? So, normally it might be about a week earlier. So when we found it on July 6th, Michigan, Indiana, Iowa, and then just most recently this week, Wisconsin as well. So, the environment with the rains that have come through the past, 3 weeks or so has been very conducive for tar spot development there. This field here, it's because we have it on the residue here. That hasn't blown in or anything from the US or so. So how does that relate to previous history? So it might be a week or two from normal than what we would have seen in Michigan and in Indiana and all that kind of stuff. 2018, the first report there was around July 12th, so very similar. That year was very similar to what we've been experiencing so far. So it's been cooler weather and these wet conditions. We always talk about, tar spot likes cool conditions, maybe, that 18, 20, 25 degrees Celsius and under. Well, what? It survives in Florida where it's really hot. It's moisture. I think moisture is the key here. If we continue to have these moisture patterns, these rain events, around here, around Rodney, we've had anywhere from 10 to 16 inches of rain in many fields over the past 3 weeks. And so again, that's a perfect environment. I'm hot, I'm sweaty right now. It's ideal for this as well. So 2018, what happened there in Michigan, for instance, and Iowa and Indiana and Illinois is that the disease started off at this point and continued to develop because the conditions were favorable. And in some of those fields, they saw a 30 to 50% yield reduction. They also saw early senescence. So by the time we got into late August, mid-August, many of those fields had died off and that. So you had that premature death and that. So that's where the yield loss came in. So what are we doing right now? We're going to monitor, of course, this field and other fields in the province. You know, the fact that we've seen it here, it's going to show up in some others. We hope that it'll continue to stay at this low severity, low incidence. If it gets warm but dry, that should slow things down considerably. But if we get into this pattern, as we're seeing right now in those areas that have a lot of moisture, be on the alert for tar spot. And so we're trying to just to assess it. And what we're doing in this field right here in these plots, these are our fungicide trials. These are in conjunction with our US colleagues, our tar spot working group. And so we have similar locations in Michigan, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and other locations in the US for tar spot as well. We also have 65 different commercial corn hybrids that you maybe have in your own field right now that we're also assessing with the companies to see what the hybrid differences are for tar spot, and do they correlate with what they've seen, if they have seen that, say, in US trials and that. But for many of these hybrids, they've never been assessed under tar spot conditions, and so that's some great information for us, but more importantly for you as well.
You know, Albert, I watched that video 3 times yesterday. I never heard the rooster until just that right there.
The rooster's our friend. He comes to visit all the time.
Okay, so now what I heard there is that we were really focused on the temperature, but now it's maybe the moisture, because Ontario hasn't necessarily been cool this year. So it is a moisture issue, you think?
Yeah, it's more on the leaf wetness side, especially. And, just most of us would see, 8 o'clock at night through till almost midday, there'd be moisture or leaf wetness in many cornfields out there. And ideally, and you'll notice these with some of these images or as you're scouting, one of the areas to look at on the leaf itself is about 2/3 of the way up the leaf. That curved portion where it stays wettest longest is where we have seen a lot of the initial tar spot lesions developing on there. And that's where you often go from 1 to 2 to quite quickly into getting 20, 30 lesions on there. So target those areas on that area that has leaf wetness the longest on there for sure.
So how do I minimize my risk?
Wow. First of all, we're in that process right now of learning as much as we can from this disease. It's new to us, and not only new to us, but new to the Corn Belt as well. And so from a minimized standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, we've got our fungicide products, and we've been evaluating, Dave Hooker and I have been working on, say, northern corn leaf blight, again, with our crop protection network people. And I know Peter had mentioned in the chat, it's the crop protection network.org website there that has a lot of information on tar spot, white mold, all kinds of stuff there as well. So our work that we've been working closely with our colleagues there on northern corn leaf blight is directly applicable even to tar spot. So many of those fungicides that are very efficacious and work very well against northern leaf blight, northern corn leaf blight, also work very well against tar spot. And the timing has also come into play in that tassel to that silking time frame that we would use for, say, northern and gray leaf spot, but also for gibberella and dawn, are also common timings for us as well.
Okay,
so one area is the hybrid side.
Okay, so I'm just going to put an image up on the screen here. This isn't you supply me with this image. It's an untreated tar spot infection. How do I know this is tar spot versus something else?
Well, first of all, the images we showed earlier through the clip and that, you'll start seeing those little tar-like lesions on the leaves themselves. At first, they'll be flat and they may be very difficult, especially when you see 1 or 2 lesions on the leaf there. Come back in a day or two, what you'll start to see is a stroma or a bump starting to form there. And that's where the spores or ascospores are released as well. So this image here, I went out this morning at 8 o'clock and took this one. This is from our untreated fungicide trial there. This is on we've got 2 hybrids in there. This is on a more susceptible hybrid, and you can see on July 2nd and those early images, even up to July 21st, there was maybe a little bit of concentration of some of the lesions on some of the leaves, but you can see it's moved its way up now, and it's gone above the ear leaf, and it's starting to do what tar spot does. It starts to, once you start getting into that 30 to 40 and maybe 50% coverage on a leaf, the leaf shuts down. It's that shutting down or that early senescence that is that causes those significant impact on yield. And that other image shows, our fungicide application where similar timing, much different. We still have some tar spot where we had it down low, but you can see it's like night and day between the two.
Yeah. And then you got this shoot. There's the map. What is?
Yeah, so Damon Smith and Marty Chilvers and others through the Tar Spot Working Group in the U.S. have been working on a prediction model. And here is the Tar Spotter app. It's part of the Field Profit suite as well. And basically what you're looking at here is the percentage of risk. So it's like, rainfall percentage, etc. And you can see it correlates quite well with where we've been finding tar spots. So that, as West Elgin that first week of July, then we found Essex, then last Friday added on Middlesex as well as Lambton, and then Rob Miller and a few others have seen it in Norfolk as well. And so now, we're starting to expand, and, other areas, plan to get down into the Niagara area and north of Guelph and that. I was in the Elora area last week, didn't see any there. But again, it's a tool to help us in terms of assessing your risk, but also in terms of fungicide applications as well. And that will change. North Perth, Huron, into Bruce, Goderich, and all that were yellow. But again, we've had those rain events come through that increases that risk.
Awesome stuff. Okay, let's bring in here Tracy. There we go. Perfect. Okay, good. Well, the gang's all here. So now, if anybody has any more questions, please enter them in the chat, whether you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, or at realagriculture.com/live. I got a few more here to kind of keep going. Tracy, you mentioned that if we have that rotation, we kind of do a reset on the corn rootworm. How much time am I buying myself by creating that reset?
Part of that depends on the landscape, and others in the area have done that same reset. So if it's in continuous corn, acre after acre is corn, your single field reset is not going to do much because there'll still be adults in the area that lay their eggs in. But in general, if more producers at least go every third year or fourth year into a non-corn crop, that starts to slowly knock down the rootworm population. We just had ideal conditions for rootworms to build up the last few years, and they're going to stay that high until we don't give them the crop that they want. And rotating out doesn't necessarily mean we're taking away feed options. Christine O'Reilly, our grazing and forage specialist, put together some alternative feeding options, like going in with some kind of winter cereal and then followed with sorghum Sudan grass, or for silage replacement, or even some of the barley and other cereals that can replace grain. Though they will say, work with your nutritionist to make sure that you're getting the right ration there. But still, it's not that they're leaving them completely dry. But we need to get rid of corn some years to knock this pest down.
Okay, Albert, you mentioned genetic resistance. There isn't any. When you talk to seed developers, how far are we away from some sort of genetic resistance to tar spot?
Well, yeah, we don't know that right now. We don't have any genetic resistance. Everybody's trying to get that evaluations going, and with a new disease or a new pest, insect pest, etc., you're trying to find those populations where you can evaluate them with uniform pressure in that, and hence our goal here with the West Elgin, the Rodney location. And like Peter mentioned, there is no resistance. It is tolerance, and so we've got 64, 65, well, 64 different hybrids now because one was not Roundup tolerant. And with that, what we're trying to do is, and we're seeing differences right now, and one of Peter's questions there too is in terms of plant defense mechanisms. There's another symptom, it's called the fisheye, and that's where you've got your stroma or your tar spot, and then you get a circle around that, a significant circle where it's tanned or dead tissue. And evaluations this week on our hybrids, we're starting to see certain hybrids start showing that fisheye symptom. So that could be an induced resistance or a plant defense mechanism that's given us that second type there. Key will be, in that impact will be, what is the rate of infection? So those ones that are slower to develop tar spot would have greater tolerance than those that the disease can just grow quite quickly, or the slope will be very steep. So we're trying to evaluate that.
Okay. Tracy, thinking back to the Jocelyn Smith video, we're doing those root ratings. How many plants should I be digging up to have a look at those roots and doing those ratings?
At least 10 would be ideal. I mean, certainly look around. It depends on how large the field is, but any plants that are starting to show any signs of brace roots regrowing or some goosenecking or flat out lodging, go and start digging and seeing. And more so, not just the field's edge, because that's where rootworm adults in particular are going to be very active, but go throughout the field and get a good assessment.
Yeah, and dig them out. Don't just try to yank them out, of course.
No, so yeah, we had tried to do a video on that. Try and take as much of the root ball, because obviously the shovel's going to clip some of the roots if you don't. Then you can take it back, soak them in a pail of water for a little bit, and then just hose them down with either a pressure washer or just even a good hose nozzle to really get that dirt off and see the roots.
And remind us what is the timing of that rating?
So late July is ideal. As soon as you start to get into mid-August, those roots start to do what we call bottle brushing. They make little roots from the injuries to try and, again, stabilize the plant and compensate, get some nutrients back into the plant. So it's really hard to see that clipping mid-August on. But that doesn't mean don't do it. Go and check it out. And again, call the experts. We can also come out and look and do it for you.
Yeah, fantastic point. Question here from Peter. What about the nematodes for rootworm? Any early indications of efficacy?
Not yet. It's too early. So we did 5 or 6 sites on rootworm this year, hoping it wasn't too dry in some of the locations. But it does take them about a year to establish to high enough levels to actually start seeing some impact. So fingers crossed, we did soil samples to see if they're actually there and present. And we'll do that again next year to see, and then we'll rate some roots to see how they've done.
And Albert, I think you mentioned you don't really have a number yet on the yield loss from tar spot. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the rest of the season and that. But we, in those, in our fungicide trial right there, we're already starting to see, the ear leaf and above that's starting to turn yellow and that. So that will have a significant impact on yield. And the ranges what we've seen in the U.S. and in most years, and for Ontario, for most growers, if you see the disease, it's not probably going to be for another couple of weeks or more. And again, it still takes about 4 weeks or more to develop and that. So in that case, such as last year, the yield impact was minimal.
Okay. Tracy, when it comes to the rootworm, is there some stewardship information that is out there for people?
Yes, absolutely. So we've worked, the Corn Pest Coalition, we have a new website, we just revised it, so there's a lot of information there. We also joined forces with CropLife IRM Task Force, so you'll see Manage Resistant Now fact sheet coming out very shortly. And of course, Field Crop News. We've got a ton of information on rootworm there, including some options and long-term sustainable practices, trying to mitigate this issue going forward, because we're to the point where we just can't just do BT, below ground BT hybrids year after year.
Easy solution exhausted. We've got, we've got to go back to some of the other practices as well. Well, yeah, absolutely. Hey, we're out of time. This has been a fantastic morning here of agronomic information on some very, very critical topics for Ontario growers. Albert, thanks a lot for joining us here today on this special edition of the Agronomist Ontario Diagnostic Days edition.
Thank you very much and appreciate it.
Tracy, you as well. Great job.
Thank you.
Cameron,
great to be here.
Yes. Everybody, check below. There's the website to get your CCA credits. Don't miss out on that. We're dropping a new episode of Ontario Diagnostic Days in 2 short weeks. And, of course, you can go back and you can watch some of the prior episodes as well. Encourage you to do that. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here this morning, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, everyone.